Bias thrives under the armor of authority. In a downtown corridor, pulsing with protest, a black woman exits a coffee shop and crosses into a moment she didn't create. Officer Darren Collier sees her pause and decides it's defiance. He sees threat where there is only composure. He doesn't ask her name. He doesn't know she's a federal judge. Her silence forged in courtrooms, her restraint earned through years of command. To him, she's just another body to move. So he strikes. But instead of control, he sparks the beginning of his undoing, and a reckoning his department won't escape. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The heat in the city pressed down like a heavy palm against the skyline, warping the air above the pavement and giving the illusion that everything was swaying gently under pressure. The kind of heat that clung to the back of your neck and made even the sidewalks feel aggressive. Downtown was louder than usual, but not unmanageable. Just crowded, congested, the kind of tension you could taste before it ever reached your ears. The sound of chanting rolled down the avenue like a wave caught in concrete. Voices layered over car horns, sirens, and the dull whir of police helicopters circling overhead. Judge Marlene Stokes pushed the door open to Bean and Ledger, a boutique coffee shop squeezed between a vintage camera store and a boarded-up barbershop. Inside, the air had been cool and still, filled with the earthy scent of fresh espresso and quiet music from a corner speaker. Outside, it was chaos in the way only modern cities could deliver. Organized, over-policed, and one confrontation away from boiling over. She wore a gray pantsuit, her court badge clipped out of view but tucked securely in her handbag. There was no robe today, no clerk shadowing her, no courtroom protocol to insulate her from the world's disorder. Her only plan had been a late lunch and a moment to think. In truth, she hadn't wanted to be downtown at all, but she needed the walk, needed the break from headlines and motions and the buzz of her own mind. What she didn't need, and certainly hadn't planned for, was to walk straight into the path of armed men on horseback. The mounted patrol advanced slowly from the opposite end of the plaza, their horses thick-legged and restless, hooves clacking over stone as the crowd tightened around them. The protesters weren't violent, at least not from what Marlene could see. She'd watched them gather an hour earlier from inside the shop, placards lifted in unison, some faces painted, others masked, all of them moving to the rhythm of a cause they refused to let die. She hadn't read all the signs, but the message was unmistakable. A local man had been killed by police the week prior, shot 6 times in the back, and not a single officer had been suspended. She crossed toward the edge of the plaza, careful not to step into the crowd, keeping her distance as she walked along the perimeter. The coffee in her hand had already cooled, but she wasn't thirsty. She just wanted to get back to her car and leave the noise behind. As she moved, a camera phone brushed past her shoulder, and she heard the digital click of a shutter. Someone muttered an apology without looking at her. Then the patrol neared. The officer closest to her pulled at his reins and jerked the horse to a halt. He was tall, broad-chested, and his helmet gleamed white beneath the sun. His uniform was immaculate, too tight, as if it had been starched into place. He raised his hand and barked a single word at her, not to the crowd or his colleagues, but directly at her. "Move!" She stopped walking, her brow furrowed, not in defiance, but in confusion. There was space around her, plenty. She was walking along a cleared path, nearer to the storefronts than the crowd. She angled her head slightly and said, calm as ever, "I'm not in anyone's way." The horse shifted again, sensing the officer's tightened grip. His eyes narrowed beneath the visor. "I said move." His voice had no patience, no interest in clarification. Just force. "I'm not interfering," she replied. "I'm walking to my car." Whether it was the tone she used, or simply the fact that she dared speak at all, something inside the man broke. He didn't yell again. He didn't issue a warning. Instead, he lifted the baton clipped to his hip and brought it down in a sudden, practiced arc toward her shoulder. The strike caught her between the collarbone and neck, jarring her entire frame, knocking her coffee from her hand, and sending her back a step with stunned breathlessness. The crowd gasped, and a dozen phones turned toward the scene like radar picking up a storm. She clutched her shoulder, not out of fear, but disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, the words half-winded. He didn't respond. He leaned forward and nudged his heels into the sides of his horse. The animal obeyed, stepping into her path and knocking her backward, this time with enough force to drive her into the ground. Her palms scraped against concrete as she caught herself, and her head snapped sideways from the jolt. She cried out, pain flaring up her arm. "Back off!" she shouted, her voice echoing over the chants, over the rising confusion. Another officer appeared from the right, then another. One shouted for her to get on the ground, not noticing or not caring that she was already there. One grabbed her by the elbow and pulled her arm behind her back. Her knees scraped against the street as she was yanked up and turned around. She protested, clearly, repeatedly, without screaming. "I am a federal judge. My name is Marlene Stokes. Let me go. You are making a serious mistake." She was met with silence, not just from the officers, but from the system they embodied. A silence so complete, it felt deliberate. Her voice, authoritative and unmistakably composed, bounced off their armor without effect. One of them, a younger cop with a fresh badge and too much adrenaline in his hands, pressed his forearm into the back of her neck as he leaned into the cuffing, adding unnecessary weight, as if he were handling a threat instead of a woman in business attire, whose only resistance had been to speak. She was pinned face down against the scalding concrete. The heat radiated through her cheekbone, and when she tried to shift slightly to relieve the pressure on her wrist, the officer snapped, "Stop resisting!" though she hadn't moved an inch beyond instinct. Another officer stepped over her back and patted down her side, yanking her bag away and tossing it to the curb like trash. The crowd, once chanting about justice, had gone eerily quiet in this corner of the plaza. Phones were up. People watched, some stunned, some recording, a few shouting for the officers to stop. But no one crossed that invisible line between protest and enforcement. No one reached her. "I am a sitting judge of the United States District Court. Verify my ID," she said again. Slower this time. Louder. "You're under arrest," the officer above her muttered without elaboration, and pulled her roughly to her feet, wrenching her shoulders back and tightening the cuffs until the metal bit into bone. Her right wrist was already swelling from the fall, and the angle at which he held it made her see stars. They marched her past a row of spectators who now understood, too late, that she had not been part of the protest at all. She wasn't holding a sign. She hadn't shouted anything. Her heels clicked against the concrete in stuttering rhythm as they half-dragged her across the plaza, toward a dark blue police van with its back doors open. She tried to walk with dignity, spine straight, jaw locked, but the cuffs dug into her nerves with every step. The officer who hit her, Collier, she would learn his name later, walked beside them, unbothered, his baton loosely swinging by his thigh like a leash. His horse had been led away by another cop, leaving him momentarily dismounted, but no less cocky. Someone from the crowd shouted, "What did she do?" And someone else answered, "Nothing. She didn't do a single thing." Marlene tried to speak once more, before they reached the van, her voice cracking not from fear, but from the sheer force she had to summon to remain composed. "I am a federal judge," she said again, not pleading but affirming, as if the words alone might finally pierce through their performance. Collier glanced at her, squinted as though considering her claim, then turned to the officer guiding her and said, "Get her in the van. We'll sort her out downtown." She was hoisted up by her elbows, shoved into the metal belly of the transport vehicle without care. Her shoulder collided with the interior wall, and her knees buckled. She caught herself before she fell completely, breathing through her teeth as the door slammed shut behind her with a final, resonant thud. Inside the van, there were no windows, just metal benches, bolts on the walls, and the thick, stifling smell of sweat and disinfectant. No one else sat inside. She was alone, wrists bound, face aching, her body pulsing with pain and indignity. The van rocked as the engine started. She tilted her head back, eyes closed, letting the motion lull her out of immediate panic. But she wasn't afraid, not in the way they expected her to be. She was already calculating. The van rolled to a halt outside the precinct just after 5, pulling up beneath a flickering security light that bathed the pavement in a jaundiced hue. As the doors opened and the city air poured in, thick with humidity and late-day smoke, Judge Marlene Stokes was met not by acknowledgement or clarity, but by the blank efficiency of a system that knew how to process bodies quickly, quietly, and without questions that complicated the paperwork. 2 officers flanked her as she stepped down onto the asphalt, her knees aching, her wrist already pulsing with deep, rhythmic pain beneath the too tight cuffs. She hadn't been read any rights. She hadn't been charged. There was no name spoken into radios, no paperwork held out with identifying information. She was simply escorted in through a side door and swallowed whole by the churning belly of the building. Gray corridors, dirty tile, the faint stink of ammonia failing to cover sweat, and something older, more human and sour. Inside, the pace was mechanical. Clerks tapped at keyboards behind glass partitions. Radios chirped. Phones rang unanswered. Uniforms moved with hollow focus, intent only on the next step, the next intake, the next person who would be logged and filed and forgotten. Marlene tried again. "My name is Judge Marlene Stokes. I'm a federal judge with the United States District Court. Verify my identity. Now." Her voice, clear and unbroken despite the throbbing behind her left eye, fell into the white noise of the intake room like a coin tossed into a flooded well. A woman behind the desk looked up, paused, and then looked away again. The officer beside her nudged her forward, guiding her to a fingerprint scanner, where a latex-gloved technician took her hand without a glance and flattened her swollen wrist against the machine's glass surface. She winced, but did not flinch. "I have ID in my bag," she said. "You've taken it. You know who I am." The technician didn't speak. The machine beeped. A series of buttons were pressed. A label was printed. The officer standing beside her, middle-aged, mustached, with the hardened look of someone who'd grown numb in a uniform, tore the label from the printer and affixed it to a plastic bag, without comment. The bag bore a single entry on the line for identification. Female, unknown. "No," she said, more forcefully now. "You don't get to erase who I am. You don't get to bury this." The officer raised an eyebrow and looked at her sideways. "You got a problem, ma'am. You take it up with the shift lieutenant. But right now, we got process to finish. Then process it correctly. I am a federal judge. This is illegal detainment." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you shoved a horse," he muttered, turning away, as if that settled the matter. She didn't respond, not out of defeat, but because she had seen what they were doing now, how they were constructing the narrative not with facts or evidence, but through omission, through paperwork that bore no name and fingerprints that were filed under no title. This was bureaucratic erasure at its most dangerous, the kind that came not with raised voices or slammed fists, but with practiced indifference and quiet contempt. They took her photograph under fluorescent lighting that made the blood drying beneath her nostrils appear almost black. Her eye had begun to purple, and her left temple was swelling into a soft mound. The camera clicked, the screen blinked, and no one asked for her consent. Still cuffed, she was led down a narrow hallway to the holding cells. The walls here were tagged with old graffiti, initials scratched into painted cinder block, a history of forgotten names layered over time. As she passed the duty desk, one officer chuckled at something on his phone and nudged another with his elbow. "Did you see that footage yet? She walked right into the horse. Unbelievable." "Think she was one of those anti-cop types?" the second asked. "I don't know. Looked like she got what she wanted, though." Their laughter followed her like stale smoke as she was directed into a small cell, its door swinging open on shrieking hinges. The metal bench against the back wall was bolted to the floor and slick with dried sweat. No water, no toilet paper. A flickering fluorescent bulb overhead buzzed like a wasp trapped in glass. The door clanged shut. Marlene stood there for a moment, just breathing. The pain was no longer sharp, but dull and insistent, spreading through her side, up her wrist, behind her eyes. She stepped slowly toward the bench and sat down, careful to keep her hands elevated to reduce the swelling. She had not been booked under her real name. She had not been offered a call. No one had read her rights, and no one had confirmed her identity. The ID in her bag, a federally issued badge with her full title, had either been ignored or deliberately withheld. She closed her eyes, not to rest, but to contain the fury building inside her. It wasn't the physical pain that gnawed at her. It was the deliberate erasure, the cruel and casual efficiency of it all. It was the way the officers had looked through her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle to be moved, a problem to be processed, another voice to be silenced before the end of a shift. She thought of her courtroom, the bench she'd sat behind just the day before, hearing arguments about civil liberties and due process from attorneys who had never lived a moment of what she was experiencing now. She thought of the seal above her head, the one etched in oak and stone that read, "Equal justice under law." It had always sounded aspirational, but never hollow. Until now. The noise outside her cell grew louder as more arrests were brought in. Shouting, laughter, the occasional clatter of handcuffs against desks. But inside her, the silence was growing deeper, sharper. It wasn't shock. It was resolve, coiled and ready. They didn't know who they'd dragged in. Not yet. The light in the holding cell had never shut off. Not once throughout the night. It flickered slightly with each shift in current, buzzing faintly overhead like an insect that couldn't die. Judge Marlene Stokes didn't sleep. She sat upright on the metal bench, arms crossed, wrists aching, watching the door with a stillness that came not from calm, but from control. The kind that had been sharpened over years behind the bench, where silence could be more powerful than any outburst. When the door finally opened, there was no announcement, no summons, no apology. A uniformed officer with a clipboard stepped into view, called out, "Let's go," and turned without waiting to see if she followed. She rose slowly, every joint stiff, muscles bruised beneath the skin, and walked out into the corridor where a plastic tray sat on a counter containing her belongings. Her phone, her wallet, her ID badge. The bag that had been torn open, now clumsily reassembled with a zip tie. No words were exchanged. No paperwork was offered. No charges were stated. She signed nothing. No record of her booking was handed to her. Only silence, clipped and administrative. The exit door buzzed open. She stepped into the morning light, and for a moment, the brightness disoriented her. The sun had risen while she sat unnoticed, unseen, in a holding cell labeled for someone who supposedly didn't exist. Her driver, who'd been called discreetly by her clerk only after realizing she'd missed a scheduled call, waited across the street. No police escort, no explanation, just bruises, swelling, and a silence that stretched like wire between every bone in her body. She climbed into the back seat without a word and closed the door behind her with the quiet of someone preserving energy for the war ahead. The ride home was silent. She didn't ask for news. She didn't turn on her phone. Her wrist had darkened into a mottled purple, and the scrape along her cheekbone still wept clear fluid. Her robe, back at home on its hanger, felt like it belonged to someone else now. The city outside the window moved normally, children running along crosswalks, buses pulling into stops, coffee lines forming, but the air around her had changed. It was thick with betrayal. At home, she went straight to the bathroom, stripped down carefully, and stared into the mirror. Her reflection was worse than she'd imagined. The bruises were blooming deeper now, the ones on her back just beginning to show through in long, blunt marks from the fall. Her left eye was red around the edges, her lips split, her shoulder visibly swollen. She took a photo, not with anger, not yet, but with documentation in mind. She opened her cabinet, found the sterile gauze, and started cleaning her own face in slow, practiced movements. By the time she turned her phone on, it was nearly noon. Messages flooded in one after another. Missed calls, news alerts, system pings. But one name stood out at the top of the screen. Official statement released. City Police Department. She opened the link. The department had issued a press release just an hour earlier, accompanied by a carefully edited video clip lasting only 23 seconds. It showed a crowd gathered near mounted officers. The angle was wide, the resolution grainy, and the timestamp had been cropped. In the video, Marlene was visible for just a moment, stepping near the patrol line. The clip cut quickly after she raised one hand, possibly shielding her face, possibly in reaction, just before she was taken down. The statement below the video read in clean, professional font. During yesterday's demonstration, a female suspect interfered with the movement of mounted patrol and resisted multiple lawful commands. Officers acted to disperse a disruptive element within an aggressive group. The department is reviewing the incident and remains committed to transparency and community safety. She read it again, not because she hadn't understood it, but because she couldn't believe the speed and precision of the lie. Beneath the release, quotes had already begun to surface from anonymous sources close to the investigation, each more rehearsed than the last. One claimed she had inserted herself between officers and protesters. Another reported she had been non-compliant, and that officers had no way of knowing her identity at the time. A third quote was more pointed, asserting that she had provoked the horse by moving directly into the path of mounted control efforts. The local news stations ran the footage on loop, each adding their own slight inflection of doubt, spinning context like, "Sugar." Anchor voices referred to her not as a judge, but as an unidentified woman believed to be involved in the protest crowd, even though no photo of her holding a sign, chanting, or engaging with protesters existed. One host speculated whether her refusal to comply might be connected to prior strained views toward police conduct, as if angering a horse could be read from court transcripts. And then came the union. The Fraternal Order of Police issued its own response before the sun had fully set, defending the officers involved and denouncing false narratives pushed by politically motivated actors. They did not name her directly, but the insinuation was as thick as molasses. The union's president stood behind a podium during an impromptu press conference, surrounded by flag pins and solemn-faced officers in dress blues, and spoke of the dangerous climate our officers face every day especially during coordinated anti-police efforts. The mayor, when asked at a scheduled event later that afternoon, offered only, "I won't be commenting until the department completes its internal review." No mention of her injuries. No question about excessive force, just a procedural shrug designed to disappear under the weight of weekend news. By the time the evening rolled in, the machine had already settled into place. Her name had not yet been officially tied to the event, but the story had been built brick by brick. Aggressive crowd, uncooperative woman, necessary intervention. Even in absence, her role had been defined without her. They had tried to reduce her to a shadow before she had spoken a single word in public. But what they didn't seem to understand, or perhaps had simply never imagined, was that she was not one of the nameless. She was not disposable. She knew the law they were hiding behind, the loopholes they were twisting, the codes they were abusing, and she would not be content to survive this in silence. She sat in the quiet of her living room, surrounded by legal texts and half-drawn curtains, and opened her laptop. Her fingers, still stiff, still aching, found their rhythm. The first motion would be filed within the hour. Not against a single officer. Not against the department. Against the entire infrastructure that had conspired to forget her. She did not speak to the media. Not once. Not when they camped outside her brownstone, not when they left business cards in her mailbox, not when the segment producers sent their polite requests disguised as sympathy. She watched their coverage silently, face unreadable as they speculated over her silence, treating restraint as mystery, guessing whether it was part of a legal strategy or personal trauma. But the truth was simpler than any of their theories. She had nothing to prove to cameras. Her work would speak in the language the system understood best. Filings, subpoenas, contempt motions, and hard, unrelenting precedent. By mid-morning on the third day after her release, she sat alone in her study, wrapped in a loose black sweater, her injured wrist supported by a brace, her face still marked but less swollen now. The walls around her were stacked with casebooks, copies of the federal code, and thick annotated binders from her own docket, cases she had once presided over with firm clarity and little tolerance for procedural games. Now, she found herself navigating those same rules, not as judge, but as plaintiff, as citizen, as injured party moving through a system designed to outlast truth. The first motion she filed was strategic and surgical, an emergency motion to preserve all video, audio, and communications related to the incident. She addressed it to the district court under her jurisdiction, marked it urgent, and attached a preliminary list of items: unedited body cam footage from the mounted unit, surveillance feeds from the plaza, patrol logs, internal officer communications, and radio transmissions. It was not an accusation, yet. It was a protective measure, one she knew the department would try to sidestep. Within 24 hours, the city attorney filed an objection. According to their office, no complete body cam footage existed. The department claimed a technical malfunction affected several mounted patrol units during the protest. One body cam had allegedly overheated. Another's data was corrupted. A third, they reported, had not been activated due to an administrative oversight. They attached a signed statement from the precinct's technical supervisor and asked the court for understanding during what they described as an active period of high operational demand. The footage was missing, or so they said. Marlene read the response in full, twice, jaw tight, fingers tense on the keyboard. Her expression didn't change, but her breathing slowed as the implications settled into place. It wasn't just about the loss of footage. It was the beginning of a familiar playbook, a slow drip of partial information, just enough to cloud the issue, but never enough to clarify anything. She did not wait for permission. Within hours, her legal team, assembled quietly, a mix of former clerks and civil rights attorneys who had once stood before her bench, filed a second set of motions, subpoenas for every single internal communication between officers assigned to the mounted patrol that day, including shift assignments, disciplinary records, unit training protocols, complaint histories, and emails from supervisors logged in the 72-hour window surrounding the incident. The department responded with redactions so aggressive the pages looked censored by a foreign intelligence agency. Names were blacked out, timestamps obscured, full sections replaced with legal justifications citing officer privacy, internal security, and ongoing departmental review. The substance was gone, gutted by bureaucracy and legal insulation. Her team filed a formal objection. They followed it with a motion for contempt, aimed at the precinct commander and city council for failure to comply with court-ordered discovery. The language was measured, the tone precise, but the intent was unmistakable. She would not be stonewalled. She would not accept technological failure as coincidence. She would not pretend this was normal. The city doubled down. Their filings became defensive, then evasive. They accused her legal team of being politically motivated. They suggested her position as a federal judge complicated public perception. In one memorandum, the city attorney argued that the plaintiff's judicial status may create undue bias in the court's handling of procedural matters. It was a thinly veiled attempt to undermine her standing without addressing her claim. She ignored the bait. The filings continued. Within the week, she filed suit against the police department under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, citing excessive force, unlawful detainment, and systemic obstruction. The complaint ran nearly 60 pages and included a detailed narrative, still photographs of her injuries, affidavits from bystanders, and documentation of the city's shifting statements. Then she expanded the battlefield. She sent formal requests for oversight intervention to the Department of Justice, citing a pattern of misconduct in the city's Mounted Patrol Division. She forwarded sealed documents to state-level judicial conduct boards, asking them to reopen disciplinary records that had previously been sealed. She flagged concerns to the State Civil Liberties Commission and requested a full audit of use-of-force reports tied to mounted units in the past 5 years. Every motion was deliberate, every request documented. Her legal filings created a paper trail too extensive to bury quietly. Still, no one from the department apologized. No officer acknowledged wrongdoing. The footage remained lost, according to them, and the union, now emboldened by the mayor's silence, began fundraising off the narrative of smear campaigns against honorable officers under attack. Meanwhile, Marlene said nothing to the public. She didn't sit for interviews. She didn't release statements. But in private, her team worked daily, late into the night, compiling inconsistencies and building the timeline with a surgeon's discipline. It wasn't just about the assault anymore. It was about the machine that moved to erase her, that had done the same to hundreds of others with less visibility and fewer tools to fight back. And though the court dates had not yet been set, and the media had begun to lose interest without fresh spectacle, she knew this was the moment the battle turned, because the system had bet on her silence. And she had made the one move they weren't prepared for. She stayed calm, stayed quiet, and kept going. By the second week, the silence from the city began to crack, but not in the direction of accountability. It began, instead, with whispers. A single news outlet, one of the smaller, more sensationalist networks with a reputation for chasing headlines over truth, aired a segment speculating about Judge Marlene Stokes's mental fitness in light of what they described as her unexpectedly aggressive legal blitz against the city. The language was careful, hedged, but unmistakably seeded for doubt. The piece cited an anonymous source familiar with her personal history and alluded to an incident from years prior involving a medical leave of absence. No specifics were provided, but the insinuation was clear. Instability, unreliability, a potential history of emotional or psychological distress. The anchor's tone was neutral, the smile professional, but the damage had been planted in prime time. Within hours, the story spread, picked up and reshaped by other platforms, each layering the narrative with their own color, some wondering aloud whether her past could be relevant context to her behavior, others questioning whether her judicial temperament had ever come into question behind closed doors. None of them had facts, none of them had context, but all of them had airtime. Marlene read the transcript of the original report in silence, eyes tracking each line as her legal team debated how best to respond. She didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come, the attempt to discredit her, to shift attention from institutional misconduct to personal speculation. But knowing didn't make it easier to stomach. By morning, the attack escalated. A PDF began circulating online, dumped without explanation into comment threads and buried in discussion boards, then elevated by accounts that seemed too coordinated to be organic. It was a partial medical record, real but decades old, detailing a short voluntary inpatient stay following the death of her younger brother, back when she had been a law student, barely 22, and shattered by grief. The document noted symptoms of acute anxiety and insomnia. No diagnosis, no medication, no subsequent incidents. Still, the leak was deliberate, and the intent behind it unmistakable. The union wasted no time. In a hastily arranged press conference held outside their headquarters, their president, a former officer turned mouthpiece, stood flanked by officers in dress blues, and launched into a speech about the importance of emotional stability in leadership. Without naming her directly, he referenced dangerous efforts to weaponize personal grievances against our officers, and caution the public against placing too much faith in individuals who may not be operating from a place of rationality. Marlene watched the clip later that evening with her legal advisor, her jaw set, her hands steady on the armrest of her chair. They were baiting her, trying to provoke a misstep, a public outburst, a televised moment of fury they could loop endlessly to match the story they had scripted. She gave them none of it. Instead, the very next day, she filed 2 new complaints, one for retaliation, the other for unauthorized access and release of sealed medical records, both carrying federal implications. Her legal team added named defendants this time, individuals within the department's Internal Affairs Office who had access to sealed personnel files, along with technical staff who had administrative privileges over the city's record systems. Every name was backed by time logs, login data, and internal routing protocols obtained through prior discovery. The suit named the union as well, under a civil conspiracy claim. But the campaign against her didn't slow. Pundits continued to speculate. Online forums filled with coordinated threads questioning her credibility, her impartiality, her past rulings. They cherry-picked 1 or 2 controversial decisions from her tenure and framed them as proof of bias, painting her as a judge who had long held resentment against law enforcement. The irony that those same decisions had upheld due process and protected defendants' rights regardless of affiliation was lost in the churn. And yet, for every headline twisted against her, something else was beginning to take shape, quietly at first, then louder. Community groups, many of which had long felt abandoned by the justice system, began organizing. A local coalition that had once fought for independent police oversight issued a public statement naming her by title and demanding a federal investigation into the precinct's history of excessive force. law students from 2 nearby universities staged silent protests on the courthouse steps, carrying signs that read, "We believe Judge Stokes." A group of black women lawyers, judges, and clerks published an open letter of support in a national legal journal, signed by hundreds. Then came Reverend Ty Carter. He'd been quiet for years, a once prominent civil rights figure whose voice had guided the city through darker times, but who had gradually stepped back from the front lines, worn down by the weight of too many funerals and too little change. But when he appeared outside City Hall that Friday, gray-bearded, slow-moving, cane in one hand and a microphone in the other, the crowd that gathered knew it meant something. "They tried to silence her," he said, voice weathered but still full of fire. "They tried to erase her like they've erased so many before. But they forgot who she is. They forgot what she's built. And they sure forgot who's watching now." The crowd responded not with cheers, but with a solemn kind of unity. Heads nodding, fists raised, voices steady. It wasn't spectacle. It was memory. Marlene didn't attend the rally, but she saw the footage later. She watched as her name was spoken, not as a subject of scandal, but as a symbol of resistance, of survival, of relentless clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply turned back to her work, added the next filing to her list, and prepared for what would come next. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. The message arrived through a private email address her clerk maintained for judicial correspondence not meant to pass through official channels. It came in late, 2:11 a.m., without signature, without introduction, without any flourish. The subject line read only, "You don't know me, but I know what they're hiding." Marlene read the message 3 times before responding. The body was short, but precise. The sender claimed to be a former officer with first-hand access to internal documents tied to her case. He said he had been watching the city's reaction, the union's spin, and the quiet storm she was unleashing. And he said he couldn't stand what they were doing to her. Not anymore. A burner address was included. A note followed. "There's more than you think. They knew who you were. They had time to stop it. They didn't." By the end of the day, the documents arrived in an encrypted drop. 67 pages of internal communication, nearly all of it from the first 24 hours after her arrest. They included emails from precinct commanders, messages between union reps and department PR staff, even fragments of a draft statement that had been rewritten 3 separate times before being issued to the public. Most shocking of all, buried on page 31, was a thread forwarded from a sergeant's account that read, "Judge's ID came up in system. Do not reference by name until cleared by comms. Advise all units, treat as UF, unknown female, until statement finalized." They had known. Not just the arresting officer, but the watch commander, the booking sergeant, and at least 2 administrators responsible for shaping the department's narrative. They had deliberately ignored her identity because it complicated the story they were preparing to tell. She didn't speak for a long time after reading it. She just stood at the window of her study, the emails open on her screen behind her, the soft rhythm of traffic outside offering no relief. There had been moments over the last 2 weeks, during the late-night attacks on her character, during the leak of her private medical record, when she'd questioned how deep the resistance to truth would go. Now, she had an answer. They hadn't just lost control of the story. They had engineered its misdirection with clinical precision. A follow-up message came the next morning. The sender now identified himself. Marcus Wynn, former patrol officer. 5 years in uniform, 2 of them attached to the mounted unit before requesting reassignment. His name had never crossed her desk in court, but it had come up in old oversight reports, quietly, modestly, connected to internal disagreements over crowd control procedure. A name she hadn't remembered then. One she would never forget now. He had been monitoring communications after leaving the force, using an old backdoor account he hadn't shut down. According to him, the department had flagged the incident within 30 minutes of her arrest, well before her name had reached the public. The orders had been clear. Do not engage media. Do not admit fault. And under no circumstances release unedited footage. They would control the optics. They always did. In his message, Marcus made a final promise. There is uncut footage. I've seen it. Mounted Patrol had a secondary camera mounted on the flank, meant for internal training. The unit keeps backups. I know where they store them. Her legal team absorbed the news like a jolt of electricity. A meeting was called within hours. Files were locked. Affidavits drafted. A motion was prepared to demand access to all off-network archival footage maintained by the Mounted Division, including training simulations, disciplinary reviews, and raw video from mounted deployments during public demonstrations. It would be filed under seal quietly to avoid tipping off the department too soon. Still, the pressure mounted. As her legal filings intensified and her story spread through underground channels, the smear campaign against her continued in more insidious ways. Old photos were dredged up from law school years. A columnist wrote a piece titled, "When Judges Act Like Activists," making no direct mention of her name, but leaving no doubt whom the rhetoric targeted. And in the more toxic corners of the internet, digital mobs formed to dissect every known detail of her personal life, hunting for inconsistencies, scraps of vulnerability. Marlene read some of it, not out of vanity, but necessity. She needed to know what version of herself they were constructing, what armor she would have to wear next. But even she hadn't been prepared for the moment that came late one night, just past midnight, when her own sister called, hesitant, worried, and said, "I just saw a picture of you online. It was from when you were in the hospital that summer. Why would they do that? Why would they put that out now?" There was a pause on the line, and for once, Marlene had no immediate answer. The law had always been her shield, her structure, her language. But in that moment, hearing the worry in her sister's voice, she felt the reality of what was being taken from her. Not just privacy, not just reputation, but the quiet dignity that came from a life lived by the rules she thought protected everyone. She didn't cry. That part of her had long since hardened. But after she hung up, she sat alone in the dark of her living room, the glow of her computer casting shadows across the floor, and allowed herself the rare indulgence of silence. She wasn't broken. Not even close. But the toll was real. And if she was to continue, if she was to finish what had now gone far beyond her own assault, she would need more than legal filings. She would need exposure, unfiltered, undeniable. Marcus Wynne had already given her the match. Now she just needed the flame. It surfaced on a Tuesday morning, just before 9, released without preamble on a small digital rights forum known for publishing leaked government documents. The video was embedded between grainy thumbnails and lines of metadata. There was no headline, no caption, just a timestamp, a file name, and the words, "Uncut," from the flank. By 10 a.m., it had been copied to 3 different platforms. By noon, it was everywhere. The footage ran for just under 4 minutes, captured from a body-mounted secondary camera worn by one of the mounted officers, not the ones issued for patrol accountability, but the kind used internally for training and analysis. The angle was clear and unflinching. The horse's head loomed in frame, but the lens sat high enough to capture the plaza, the crowd, and most critically, the full sequence of what had happened. Judge Marlene Stokes could be seen walking out of the coffee shop, wearing slate-gray business attire and carrying a paper cup in one hand. a handbag over the other arm. She did not enter the crowd. She did not speak to protesters. She walked along the sidewalk, separate, calm, unarmed. Her expression was neutral. Her posture was relaxed. Then came the voice of the mounted officer, Darren Collier, shouting for her to move, despite her being at least 6 feet from the horse's path. The camera captured every second of the exchange. Her voice, measured and deliberate, replied, "I'm not in anyone's way." The next moment, he raised his baton and struck her across the clavicle. The impact sent her stumbling. The horse moved forward into her, knocking her to the ground. And still she did not fight back. The final minute was the worst. Multiple officers surrounded her as she sat dazed on the sidewalk, one grabbing her from behind, another forcing her face into the pavement. She shouted her name. "I am Judge Marlene Stokes," again and again. She was cuffed, bleeding, dragged across the street as cameras recorded from every angle. There was no ambiguity. There was no resisting. There was no crime. The silence online lasted barely 5 seconds after the video ended. Then the internet exploded. Hashtags that had faded into the background over the past week were suddenly revived, and new ones, "We saw her," "Charles Stokes unedited," "Charlene no justice, no edit," began trending globally. Civil rights organizations, dormant during the slow churn of the legal process, issued immediate responses. The ACLU called it one of the clearest cases of unconstitutional abuse of authority caught on tape in the last decade. Amnesty International shared the footage with a formal statement demanding independent review. Within 2 hours, the footage had crossed oceans, translated by subtitles, shared by activists in London, Nairobi, São Paulo. Cable news, which had hedged its coverage thus far, pivoted with speed and shameless precision. The same anchors who once questioned her temperament now spoke solemnly of deeply troubling use-of-force violations. The editorial boards of 2 major newspapers reversed course, issuing online retractions of earlier op-eds that had cast doubt on her account. The city government, until then locked in procedural stonewalling, scrambled to contain the fallout. At 3:15 p.m., Mayor Eleanora Banks finally appeared behind a podium, flanked by city officials, who looked as though they'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. Her expression was taut, her words meticulously scripted. "We are aware of the footage that has been released to the public," she began. "We are initiating an immediate review of all relevant departmental actions surrounding the arrest of Judge Marlene Stokes. At this time, I will not assign blame until the facts have been fully reviewed. But I assure the public, this matter is being treated with the seriousness it deserves." The press corps wasn't buying it. Reporters shouted questions as she stepped away. Why did the department deny the existence of this footage? Will the officers involved be placed on leave? Is the mounted unit still operational? No answers were given. Just silence. Again. But now it no longer belonged to her. Back at the courthouse, Judge Stokes's docket resumed at 9:01 a.m. the following day. She had not canceled a single hearing since the incident, had not stepped away from her judicial duties even once. But today felt different. Not because she had changed, but because the world around her finally understood what she had endured. Security had been tightened without her asking. Her clerk stood guard outside her chambers, sorting through a mountain of new messages, some supportive, some not, but all acknowledging her. When she stepped into the courtroom, the room was already full. Every seat along the gallery walls was occupied. Law students, journalists, quiet citizens from neighborhoods across the city, many of whom had never set foot in a federal courthouse before, but had come simply to be present. She wore her robes without expression, her face still marked by a faint line along the cheekbone where the bruising had faded but not disappeared. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the attention. She simply took her seat, tapped her gavel once, and called the first case. There were no cameras allowed in federal court, no audio, no media distractions. The day's proceedings continued exactly as they always had, with careful deliberation, precise argument, and quiet authority. But outside, the image of her rising from that bench after what had been done to her, after being silenced, miscast, and buried beneath a narrative of lies, spread faster than any press conference. People saw her, not just the woman who had been brutalized in public, but the one who stood back up, unbought, unsilenced, and deliberate. Later that evening, a formal complaint was filed by a coalition of civil rights attorneys calling for the immediate suspension of the officers involved and a federal consent decree over the entire department. Several additional plaintiffs came forward. Citizens who had experienced similar abuse at the hands of mounted patrol, but who had previously lacked the platform or courage to speak. Now they had both. And Marlene Stokes, who had once believed her story might be buried under layers of redaction and protocol, watched from behind her chamber door as the truth, at last, took on a life of its own. The department didn't speak for him this time. Officer Darren Collier, whose name had become synonymous with the footage seen by millions, stood alone behind the camera lens of a national morning show just 3 days after the video's viral spread. His uniform had been traded for a sports coat and a carefully chosen tie. Navy blue meant to read as quiet authority. His face, pale and tight, bore no sign of regret, only calculation. The network billed the interview as an exclusive, with a primetime anchor offering the usual measured tone of balance, though the framing had already shifted. Gone were the accusations of misconduct. Now, the segment was cast as a debate between perspectives. The lead-in repeated his title, Veteran Mounted Patrol Officer, and paired it with phrases like escalating tensions and moments of confusion during protest suppression. He spoke slowly, each sentence clearly rehearsed. "I feared for my safety," Collier said, eyes wide, hands motionless in his lap. That day was chaos. People were shouting. The horses were spooked. I gave lawful commands. I followed my training. I didn't know who she was. How could I have? And I didn't strike her out of malice. I responded to a threat, as I've been trained to do. The anchor nodded gently. But what about the video, Officer Collier? What do you say to critics who point to that footage as evidence of excessive force? He didn't hesitate. I understand it looks bad in hindsight, but people don't see what I saw. She moved fast. She stepped into the patrol zone. I was trying to contain a potentially explosive situation. If I hadn't acted, it could have gotten worse. For everyone. The moment aired live across the country. The clip was uploaded within minutes and dissected in near real time. It didn't hold. The footage had already burned its way into public memory, and every sentence Collier spoke was sliced apart by side-by-side analysis. Frame-by-frame breakdowns flooded social media. Experts in use of force policy appeared on every platform, pointing out inconsistencies, calling out fabrications. The narrative he clung to, of panic, confusion, urgency, collapsed under the calm precision of the uncut video. She hadn't moved quickly. She hadn't approached the horse. She hadn't raised her voice. She had done nothing but exist in a space they didn't want her in. What Collier had called a threat was, to anyone with eyes and a conscience, a composed woman walking along a public sidewalk. Public backlash to the interview was swift and ferocious. The anchor faced criticism for giving him a platform. The network scrambled to issue clarifications. And by the end of the day, the mayor's office, having remained conspicuously cautious even after the video's release, announced that 3 officers involved in the arrest had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Not just Collier, but the two others who had tackled, cuffed, and booked her as an unidentified female without question. Then came the DOJ. At 11:46 a.m. The next morning, the United States Department of Justice issued a formal announcement. In response to recent evidence and mounting allegations of systemic misconduct, the Civil Rights Division will conduct a full-scale review of the 7th Precinct and its associated operations, with particular emphasis on crowd control, use of force policies, and internal disciplinary mechanisms. The announcement was read live by the Assistant Attorney General herself, who, while measured in tone, referred to the video as deeply disturbing and emphasized the need for structural clarity and institutional reckoning. The city was no longer dealing with a PR disaster. It was staring down federal scrutiny. Marlene did not gloat. She gave no public remarks. Instead, she filed her next motion. This time it was personal. A federal civil suit against the city, the police department, the officers directly involved in her assault and detainment, and the unnamed officials responsible for suppressing evidence and leaking her private medical history. It was a comprehensive, legally airtight complaint that outlined not only the constitutional violations committed against her, but the systemic failures that had allowed it all to happen without internal correction. She wasn't seeking sympathy. She was demanding accountability. Within 48 hours of the filing, the city reached out through back channels, offering to negotiate a settlement. A large one. Confidentiality included. No admission of fault. The sum was substantial. High six figures, perhaps more if she agreed to refrain from any public discussion moving forward. She didn't need time to consider. The rejection came back that same afternoon, formal and succinct. I will not trade silence for money. This is not about compensation. It is about consequence. Her refusal landed like a blow. In City Hall, legal advisors argued over risk management while outside, protesters gathered again, this time not to demand arrests, but reforms. Their signs bore her name not as a symbol of martyrdom, but of resistance reclaimed. It was no longer just about what had been done to her, it was about what had been exposed, and how far that exposure could reach. Marlene watched the city from her apartment window that evening. The streets below crowded with faces, signs, cell phones raised. She did not address them. She would not deliver speeches. She had chosen a different path, and now the momentum she had sparked was moving without her needing to lead it. That was the point. But behind the scenes, she continued to prepare. Depositions were scheduled. Hearings were drafted. Her legal team expanded by the week, bolstered by volunteers, former colleagues, and constitutional scholars who saw in her case the fault lines of something far older and more deeply rooted. She didn't trust the system to repair itself, but she would force it to answer for what it tried to bury. And this time, there would be no editing room, no spin, no missing footage, only facts, and the will to make them matter. The grand jury convened under closed session in the federal courthouse just 4 blocks from where Marlene had been arrested. The deliberations took days. The evidence was thorough, the testimony layered with documentation, timestamps, internal policies, and an unflinching narrative shaped not by speculation, but by video, by digital trails, and by the slow unraveling of a cover-up that no longer held together. When the indictment came, it was read plainly, without flourish, without camera flashes, without any of the pageantry that sometimes clung to high-profile announcements. It simply stated that Officer Darren Collier was being charged with federal civil rights violations under color of law, including excessive force, false arrest, and obstruction of justice. The news hit the city like a thunderclap, anticipated, feared, resisted, but inevitable. Local law enforcement officials, previously vague and meandering in their public remarks, now scrambled to reframe their positions. The union issued a terse statement, filled with generic expressions of support for law enforcement families and due process, but it carried no fire, no defense of Collier's actions. The department offered only the standard line that it would fully cooperate with the ongoing federal investigation. But it was the next revelation, quieter yet more damaging, that shook the foundation more than the indictment itself. Marcus Wynn, the former officer who had leaked the footage, agreed to testify under oath before the DOJ's civil rights team. His statement confirmed what the documents had already suggested, that departmental leadership had been aware of Marlene Stokes's identity within 30 minutes of her detainment, and that a conscious decision had been made not only to suppress that fact, but to tailor the department's narrative in a way that deflected accountability and justified the use of force after the fact. Emails presented to the DOJ included phrases like, "Hold on release until legal clears ID issue," and "better to scrub now than walk back later." There were clear references to the video's internal storage location and instructions to disable secondary feeds unless requested formally through legal. Marcus identified 2 sergeants by name, one still on active duty, the other reassigned to internal affairs, who had circulated edited versions of the ET footage before the press release was issued. His testimony filled the gaps between implication and intent, leaving no plausible deniability behind. The pressure moved swiftly up the chain of command. Chief Elena Phelps, who had thus far managed to stay above the fray with polished statements and carefully limited interviews, now found herself at the center of scrutiny. For weeks she had claimed that she had not been briefed in detail prior to the department's public statement, and that any failure in transparency was due to lower-level breakdowns in communication. But the emails told a different story. One in particular, dated just 12 hours after the incident, showed her explicitly acknowledging that the arrestee was a federal judge and advising the city's legal team to manage optics ahead of verification. The wording was formal, yet unmistakably incriminating, the kind of language designed not to tell a lie, but to carefully dance around truth. But in context, and against the backdrop of what had followed, it amounted to complicity. Civil rights attorneys representing multiple plaintiffs now joined forces, filing a joint motion for discovery into departmental knowledge of systemic misrepresentation. The motion listed Chief Phelps by name, citing not only dereliction of duty, but deliberate evasion of constitutional obligations. It was the kind of legal move that carried real institutional consequences, not just for individuals, but for policies and the structure itself. Within days, Chief Phelps called a press conference. She stepped up to the podium with tired eyes and practiced stillness, flanked by department brass, who seemed suddenly more like hostages than allies. Her speech was short, written by attorneys, designed to sound conciliatory but insulated. "While I stand by my officers and the difficult decisions made in high-pressure situations," she began, "I acknowledge that mistakes were made in the handling of the aftermath surrounding the incident with Judge Stokes. I was not fully informed at the earliest stages, and I take responsibility for not demanding more immediate transparency. I welcome the DOJ's review and will fully cooperate moving forward. It wasn't enough. Not for the public. Not for the legal teams building their cases. And not for Marlene. She didn't watch the press conference live. She had, by then, grown used to the optics game, watched how the language was deployed to create the illusion of accountability while protecting the core of power. But she read the transcript that evening, alone in her chambers after her final hearing of the day. She read it slowly, line by line, understanding exactly what wasn't being said. There would be no confession, no apology, just the slow, bureaucratic retreat of those who had counted on silence, counted on obscurity, counted on the old tactics to keep them insulated. But their insulation had torn. And now, the wind was getting in. That same week, a dozen new citizen complaints surfaced, cases long buried, minor in detail but consistent in pattern, unwarranted stops, aggressive dispersals, intimidation under mounted patrol units. Most of the victims had never thought to file before, too exhausted by process or ashamed of futility. But now they stepped forward. Some had video. Some had witnesses. All had stories. And they no longer had fear. Marlene read each one. Not as a judge. Not yet. But as a woman who now understood, perhaps more than ever, how close the system always stood to the edge of betrayal. This wasn't closure. It was escalation. And the wall was beginning to break. By the time the third lawsuit was filed in a single morning, the city attorney's office stopped trying to downplay the scope of the crisis. They had crossed from damage control into something less containable, a legal siege that grew louder by the hour. Multiple plaintiffs, now organized into a unified front, were pursuing independent claims of misconduct stretching back years, all tied either directly or indirectly to the department's mounted patrol unit. These cases, once seen as too minor or isolated to matter, were suddenly linked by a central spine, a culture of impunity that had operated unchecked until Judge Marlene Stokes's arrest shattered its invisibility. Internal affairs, long regarded as a lifeless formality inside the department, was no longer capable of managing the collapse. The unit had, for years, existed in name more than in function. A division that excelled at delayed findings, carefully worded exonerations, and quiet retirements negotiated in back rooms. But now their role in the cover-up had become a matter of federal interest. Investigators from the DOJ, armed with warrants and unredacted access, raided the precinct's evidence archive just past dawn one Thursday morning, seizing hard drives, chain of custody logs, and dozens of internal memos previously denied to Marlene's team. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Within 24 hours, the head of Internal Affairs resigned, citing health and family considerations. 2 lieutenants were placed on administrative leave pending further review. Subpoenaed emails revealed that disciplinary complaints had been rerouted, rewritten, and in at least 3 cases, outright destroyed under the direction of mid-level commanders attempting to keep numbers down for quarterly reviews. City Hall issued a statement emphasizing that the mayor had no prior knowledge of these actions, but no one believed it. Not anymore. The rot was no longer hidden behind protocol. It was exposed, public, and bleeding into every level of governance. Marlene did not attend the press briefings or celebrate the fallout. She did not gloat as her civil suit expanded, or as public confidence in the department plummeted. Instead, she remained in her chambers, presiding over cases as she always had, issuing decisions with the same sharp, deliberate voice that had once held a courtroom in thrall long before her name had become a symbol. But behind her calm exterior, her legal team moved with accelerating speed. New affidavits were added to the growing stack of complaints. Witness lists grew. So did the number of federal observers now embedded in departmental oversight roles. The tone of the city shifted with it. The mayor, who had managed to hold on to a carefully neutral posture throughout the initial weeks, was now facing questions from the state legislature. Why hadn't the mounted unit been audited after the first major protest injuries? Why was Internal Affairs still answering to precinct supervisors and not an independent board? What justification could be made for multiple missing footage requests from cases that, in hindsight, followed the same pattern? The public, meanwhile, had no interest in institutional delay. Protests resumed, not chaotic, not violent, but organized with a precision that mirrored Marlene's filings. Marches moved through downtown with speakers reading excerpts from her complaint into microphones. College students formed legal research collectives, combing through public records for old misconduct logs. A group of retired judges, both state and federal, issued a statement of solidarity, calling the arrest and cover-up an assault not only on a citizen, but on the rule of law itself. Within weeks, the city faced 6 separate lawsuits stemming from the same department. One claimed unlawful detention. Another cited sustained physical injury from mounted officers during an unrelated crowd dispersion. One plaintiff was a teenager, another a retired veteran. Their stories were different, but the threads were identical. Force without provocation, followed by silence, then buried complaints. Marlene's team, though not legally attached to every case, quietly offered access to discovery material wherever relevant. They did not coordinate narratives. They did not craft press releases, but the web of truth was growing, and it no longer depended solely on her voice to be heard. The department responded with predictable desperation. An internal memo, leaked through a second whistleblower, revealed that precinct captains had been instructed to tighten all external communication and reduce off-the-record interactions with media and oversight contacts until further notice. The phrase, "contain the narrative," appeared no fewer than 3 times. The memo ended with a familiar bureaucratic refrain: "We must protect departmental integrity while this situation is reviewed." But integrity, once fractured, does not heal with paperwork. Chief Phelps had not been seen in public since her last press conference. Rumors circled of retirement packages being discussed behind closed doors. A replacement was already being floated. An outside hire, someone with no previous ties to the department. The implication was clear: a reset. But Marlene wasn't interested in resets. She was building something that couldn't be reset: a precedent. Behind the scenes, her courtroom docket grew heavier, filled with motions from attorneys citing her case, invoking it as legal context in civil rights actions, employment claims, even family court disputes involving police intervention. Her name, once offered cautiously, was now a citation. She watched the ripple grow without interfering. This wasn't about celebrity or legacy. This was about the fundamental assertion that systems built to serve could not be allowed to operate without visibility, that no badge, no rank, no office could exist beyond the reach of the law. The city, once smug in its bureaucracy, had begun to feel the sharpness of that truth. It wasn't fire in the streets or graffiti on courthouse walls. It was depositions, hearings, and audits. It was walls of case files unsealing like old wounds. It was consequences, not headlines. The internal fire they tried to smother now burned from within, and no spin or settlement could douse it. The hearings began in a crowded municipal building stripped of ceremony, but thick with expectation. Rows of folding chairs filled the gallery, flanked by journalists, law students, retired civil servants, and quiet citizens whose expressions held no illusions about what they had come to witness. The dais, lined with city council members and independent review commissioners, was lit flatly by overhead fluorescents, but the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a civic panel. Everyone understood what was at stake, even those who tried to pretend otherwise. For the first time in decades, the department's leadership appeared not as an institution above the city, but as subjects of it. The police commissioner sat grim and wordless as recorded excerpts from internal affairs interviews played aloud. Officers once regarded as untouchable were identified by name. Precinct commanders testified in clipped tones, their answers parsed by attorneys who showed no deference to uniforms. But it was not the spectacle that held the room. It was what came on the 3rd day, when Marlene Stokes took her seat behind the microphone. There had been no announcement, no staged arrival, no entourage. She walked in quietly, wearing a tailored navy blazer over a black blouse, and sat without preamble. The room, which had been restless through much of the morning, fell into a silence that was as deep as it was deliberate. Her name had been invoked countless times over the past weeks, her face made familiar to the public in still frames and video loops. But now, here she was, not in robes, not behind a bench, but seated under oath, prepared to testify with the same composure that had once commanded courtrooms and now held the full attention of a city reckoning with its own reflection. She spoke, without flourish. Her voice was calm, but precise. She recounted the facts without editorializing, allowing the violence to speak for itself. She described her walk from the coffee shop, the unprovoked command, the baton strike, the shove from the horse, the cuffs pressed into her injured wrist. She explained how she identified herself multiple times, how she was processed as an anonymous detainee, how her request for medical attention was ignored. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize, but the weight of her presence turned each word into evidence. When asked why she had chosen not to accept the city's offer of a settlement, she paused for a moment, not for effect, but for clarity. Then she said simply, "Because this was never about compensation. It was about correction." No applause followed. No interruption. Just the respectful quiet of those who knew they were hearing something that could not be walked back. Her testimony ran just under 90 minutes. It was followed by questions from the panel, some legal, others political, but all conducted with an edge of discomfort. No one wanted to appear too sympathetic, too skeptical, too aligned. But Marlene did not lean into their hesitations. She gave them nothing but precision. Her words left no room for rhetorical rescue. The aftermath of her appearance was immediate. Public confidence in the police union, once a political juggernaut, began to erode at measurable pace. Polling released that week showed a sharp drop in approval, not only from communities long critical of law enforcement, but from moderate constituencies who now felt deceived. The union's president, who had previously defended Officer Collier with defiant speeches, canceled a press appearance and was later seen leaving City Hall with a legal team in tow. The hearings closed with a unanimous recommendation from the Oversight Board: a full dismantling of the Mounted Patrol Division, the immediate suspension of all officers under investigation, and a sweeping revision of the department's use of force policy, including a ban on baton strikes to the upper body, mandatory identity verification procedures, and strict compliance with detainee access to medical evaluation within 30 minutes of custody. Within days, the City Council passed the recommendations into binding law. The mounted unit, once paraded as a symbol of tradition and control, was officially disbanded. The horses were reassigned to parks and therapeutic programs. Their handlers, many of whom had made careers under the illusion of untouchability, were offered desk reassignments or early retirement. Some accepted. Others filed grievances. But the unit no longer existed. Not in uniform, not on paper, not in practice. What replaced it was something less visible but more powerful. A code change in how force could be applied, when it could be justified, and how it would be scrutinized. And though it did not bear her name, everyone knew where it came from. News of the hearings and the department's reformation reached national outlets within the week. Editorials ran in The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic. Civil rights advocates across the country cited her case in proposals for legislation. Law schools folded the incident into their case studies. A prominent television journalist called it the most consequential legal intervention by a sitting judge in a generation, without ever issuing a public ruling. But Marlene never joined the noise. She didn't give televised interviews. She didn't accept awards. When asked to appear at national forums, she declined. Instead, she returned to her docket. She issued rulings. She moderated hearings. And those who passed through her courtroom, defendants, prosecutors, public defenders, plaintiffs, found nothing changed in how she presided, except perhaps for one thing. There was no longer a question about who she was. And for those who had once tried to erase her, who had counted on silence and deference to cover their actions, there was now only the sound of her voice in testimony, the policies rewritten because of her, and the legacy they could neither deny nor deflect. The shift was not loud. It did not come with banners or fanfare, but it came, and it would not be reversed. The ruling came down mid-morning, issued in a clean 12-page order with the unambiguous language of federal intervention. The Department of Justice, citing repeated constitutional violations, a pattern of misconduct, and the irreparable erosion of public trust, placed the entire department under a federal consent decree. It was not temporary. It was not symbolic. It was binding. Every policy involving use of force, detainment, and public engagement would now be subject to oversight by an independent monitor appointed by the court. Quarterly compliance reports would be filed and made public. A civilian review board, long pushed to the sidelines, would be granted full subpoena power and voting authority. The order applied to all precincts. No exceptions. The city's political class, caught flat-footed by the speed and breadth of the ruling, scrambled for footing. Public statements were cautious, apologetic, full of appeals to healing and reform. But they had been bypassed. The language of justice no longer flowed through podiums and press conferences. It moved through filings and orders now, through the quiet mechanisms of judicial force, slow, deliberate, and irreversible. Chief Elena Phelps resigned within hours of the ruling. No farewell speech, no ceremony. Just a memo circulated through departmental email servers at 3:27 p.m., thanking colleagues for their service and announcing her departure, effective immediately. She left the building through a side exit, shielded from cameras, her decades in law enforcement ending not with applause, but with the closing of a car door no one rushed to hold open. The Union president's fall was less graceful. Following leaked financial records showing misused funds intended for officer legal support, and a series of secretly recorded conversations exposing coordinated disinformation efforts tied to Marlene's arrest, he was voted out of office in an emergency internal session. A statement followed, thick with evasions, blaming external pressure and partisan forces, but no one paid attention. His voice no longer carried weight. And Marlene? She said nothing. She issued no reaction, no commentary, no appearance on the courthouse steps. She simply arrived for work the next day at her usual time, entered through the west corridor, passed security, and climbed the wide marble stairs to her courtroom. Inside, the air was still. Her clerk moved with practiced rhythm, organizing case files, reviewing the docket. Court officers greeted her with polite nods, none of them awkward, none of them exaggerated. Just a simple acknowledgement that what had happened, what she had endured, what she had changed, was now a matter of record, not theater. She wore her robe, black, unadorned, familiar. It moved like part of her body, neither armor nor costume, but the same functional weight she had carried through years of rulings, deliberations, and decisions. She did not hesitate as she stepped through the chamber door and onto the bench. The gallery was full, not with press, though they had tried, not with protesters, though some were there, but with ordinary people, attorneys, interns, citizens, former defendants, current litigants, families watching the slow grind of legal process in real time. There was quiet respect in their posture, not reverence, just recognition. And in the third row, just over her left shoulder, sat a young officer in dress uniform. He was new, his insignia crisp, his badge recently issued. He sat forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes locked not on his phone or the bailiff, but on her. Marlene saw him. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. But her gaze paused for a moment as it passed across the gallery, and he seemed to understand what that meant. That this room, this process, was different now. Not perfect, not fixed, but changed. The first case on the docket was a routine matter. A motion to suppress evidence in a narcotics charge based on an unlawful search. The arguments were brief, procedural. The attorneys presented their positions. The courtroom held still, as if waiting for something larger, something theatrical, something fitting the scale of what she had endured. But that wasn't what Marlene gave them. She looked over her notes, clicked her pen closed, and then spoke with the same composure she had always maintained. Not for drama, not for cameras, but for clarity. We'll proceed. And with that, the court resumed. Not broken, not breathless, but certain. Outside the courtroom, headlines ran in digital crawl bars and front-page print. Consent decree finalized. Chief resigns. Reforms begin. Mounted unit dismantled. Civil suits advance. DOJ to monitor precinct operations. Judge Marlene Stokes returns to the bench. But inside the courtroom, the only news that mattered was that justice had survived. Not untouched, but undeterred. Marlene walked home just after dusk, her shoes clicking softly against pavement still warm from the day's sun. The city looked unchanged. Same storefronts, same cracked curbs, same folding chairs out on apartment balconies. But something in the air felt different. Lighter. Not healed, not fixed, but open in a way it hadn't been before. At the corner of 9th and Mason, a woman she didn't recognize stepped beside her at the stoplight. A quick glance, then a voice. Gentle, steady. Thank you. Marlene nodded once, quietly, before the woman disappeared into the evening crowd. Farther down the street, she passed the mural. It had gone up fast, anonymous in origin, a towering grayscale image of her mid-step, coat drawn close, expression unreadable. It wasn't heroic. It was quiet, measured, real. She didn't stop to look at it long. She didn't need to. She turned the corner toward home and exhaled slowly. The inbox was full when she arrived. Dozens of new messages, most from people she would never meet. Women describing their own arrests, their silences, their bruises, both physical and not. Some wrote in gratitude, others in grief. Many wrote just to say they were watching. She read a handful, then powered down the screen. This wasn't victory, and it wasn't closure. The consent decree was in motion, the mounted unit gone, the city bracing for reform, but the machine still turned in other corners. The precinct wasn't the only one. The names weren't the only ones. Change, she knew, didn't settle with headlines. It had to be forced, day by day, paper by paper, rule by rule. She stood at her window for a moment, watching taillights blink in rhythm across the avenue. Then she sat at her desk, pulled a clean notepad toward her, and began outlining a proposal for judicial accountability reviews on citywide arrest procedures. No press, no cameras, just another motion. They had tried to reduce her to an error in their records, a body on the pavement without a name. They failed. Now she had become something far more difficult to silence. Precedent. She wrote in long strokes across the page, then paused. The city was still burning in places, but there was a crack in the wall. She looked toward it, steady and sure. "I'm not done," she said. And she meant it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.